Ever been erased by your own blood? Ever been remembered by strangers, but forgotten by your family? Drop a comment if you've ever had to watch your own story be told by someone else. The South Carolina heat pressed against my back as I stood in the shadow of the bleachers at Fort Jackson. Graduation day. My daughter's graduation day. Katie's graduation day. I wore civilian clothes, a simple black dress that covered most of the scar running down my left arm. The fabric stuck to my skin, but I didn't move. Couldn't move. 23 years in the military teaches you to hold position even when your heart is hammering against your ribs like incoming artillery. My fingers found the small pin on my jacket lapel. Special Operations Command. The only piece of my uniform I still owned. The only piece they couldn't take back. Katie stood in formation with her unit shoulders squared, chin up. She had my posture. Emily's nose. But when she turned her head slightly, scanning the crowd, I saw something else. Something that made my throat tighten. She was looking for someone who wasn't there. The families pressed forward along the fence line, cameras flashing, voices calling out names. I stayed back, way back. Emily and her husband Katie's legal parents stood in the front row, beaming like they'd built every brick of this moment with their own hands. Emily held up her phone, recording everything. Her husband waved a small American flag. They looked perfect, complete, like a family should look, like we used to look before I became the thing they needed to forget. The ceremony ended with the traditional march. Katie's platoon moved in perfect synchronization, boots hitting the pavement in rhythm. I watched every step, memorizing the way she carried herself, the way she kept her eyes forward even when the crowd erupted in cheers. When the formation broke, chaos followed. Families rushed forward, embracing their new soldiers. I watched Emily wrap Katie in a hug that lasted 30 seconds. Watched them pose for photos. Katie's arm around the woman she called Mom. I should have left then. Should have walked back to my rental car and driven away, satisfied that I'd seen her graduate, seen her succeed. But something kept my feet planted on that patch of grass. Maybe it was the way Katie kept glancing over Emily's shoulder, searching the crowd. Maybe it was the need to be present for this moment, even if I couldn't be part of it. The crowd began to thin. Families drifted toward the parking lot, still talking, still celebrating. I stayed in the shadows, watching Katie shake hands with her drill instructors, watching Emily document every handshake, every smile. That's when I saw him. The drill sergeant stopped mid-step, his conversation with another family cutting off like someone had hit a switch. His eyes locked on me, and I watched recognition flicker across his face. He was young, maybe 30, with the kind of sharp awareness that comes from years of training others to stay alive. His gaze moved from my face to the pin on my jacket, then back to my face. He said something to the family he'd been talking with, excused himself, and walked toward me. Every instinct told me to turn and leave, to fade back into the crowd and disappear the way I'd learned to do. But I held my ground. He stopped 3 feet away and slowly removed his hat. "Are you Captain Claire James?" The question hung in the air between us. I could have denied it, could have smiled and said he had me confused with someone else. But something in his voice, respect maybe, or recognition of something I'd forgotten I'd lost, made me nod. "Yes." He straightened, hat still in his hands. "We studied what you did at the academy. It changed how we train." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they hurt, but because they were real. Because someone remembered what I'd done, even if they'd forgotten who I was. "I'm Sergeant Davis," he continued. "I've been teaching combat ethics for 3 years. Your case study, The Last Stand, it's required reading for all our leadership courses." I felt Katie's eyes on me before I saw her. She'd stopped talking to Emily, stopped smiling for photos, and was staring at our conversation with the kind of intensity I recognized from looking in mirrors. She took a step toward us, then another. "That's," she said, her voice barely audible over the crowd noise. "That's my mother." The question wasn't directed at me. It was directed at the universe, at the space between what she'd been told and what she was seeing. Sergeant Davis looked between us, understanding dawning in his expression. He'd probably seen enough family reunions to recognize the complicated ones. "Ma'am," he said to me, his voice quiet. "It's an honor." He replaced his hat, nodded once, and walked away. Professional, respectful, leaving us with the space we needed. Katie stood 15 feet away, Emily's hand still on her shoulder, but her eyes were on me, taking in the scar, the pin, the way I stood like I was still on duty. "Katie," Emily said, following her daughter's gaze. When she saw me, her face went pale. For a moment, the three of us formed a triangle in the middle of the emptying field. 20 years of silence stretching between us like a minefield. I could have spoken first. Could have explained why I was there, why I'd come. Instead, I did what I'd learned to do best. I waited. I'm Claire Meredith James, firstborn, officer, mother. And to them, an embarrassment they deleted. Standing in that field, watching my sister's face drain of color, I remembered who I used to be before I became a ghost story. The James family raised soldiers. My father, Master Sergeant William James, served 3 tours in Vietnam before I was born. He came home with medals on his chest and shadows in his eyes. He taught me to shoot before I could ride a bike, to stand at attention before I could tie my shoes. "Excellence isn't optional, Claire," he'd say, adjusting my posture at the dinner table. "It's survival." Emily learned different lessons. 5 years younger, she watched our father's nightmares play out in the dark hours when he thought we were sleeping. She heard him pacing the hallway, talking to people who weren't there. She saw him flinch when doors slammed, when cars backfired, when the world reminded him of places he'd tried to forget. So Emily became the safe one. The one who colored inside the lines, who never asked questions that might disturb the fragile peace our mother worked so hard to maintain. I became the one who asked why. Why did Dad keep his service weapon in a lockbox by his bed? Why did he check the windows twice before turning off the lights? Why did Mom's smile look like she was holding her breath? The Army gave me answers, structure, purpose. A place where excellence wasn't just expected, it was the difference between coming home and not coming home. I graduated top of my class at West Point. Not because I was the smartest, but because I was the one who understood that failure wasn't just personal, it was fatal. For you, for your unit, for the mission. They commissioned me as a second lieutenant in military intelligence. By 28, I was Captain Claire James, assigned to a strategic intelligence unit under Special Operations Command. The kind of unit that doesn't exist on paper, that operates in the spaces between official policy and necessary action. I was good at my job. Maybe too good. The work required a specific kind of thinking, the ability to see patterns others missed, to make connections across data streams that seemed unrelated. You had to be comfortable with ambiguity, with operating in gray areas where the rules weren't clear. Emily never understood that part of military life. She met my career with the same wariness she'd shown toward our father's war stories. Too much uncertainty. Too many questions without clean answers. "Why can't you just do a normal job?" she asked me once when I was home on leave. Something where you come home every day and don't have to worry about classified this and classified that. I tried to explain that the classification wasn't about secrecy for its own sake. It was about protecting people's sources, methods, ongoing operations. Information that could get someone killed if it fell into the wrong hands. But Emily had already decided I was too much like our father. Too comfortable with danger, too willing to carry weight that normal people couldn't handle. Maybe she was right. Dad died when I was 31. PTSD finally won the war he'd been fighting for 40 years. He used his service weapon on a Tuesday morning while Mom was at the grocery store. Left a note that said, "The mission's complete. Stand down." Emily blamed the Army, blamed the war, blamed the culture that had taught him to solve problems with violence. I blamed myself for not seeing the signs, for not being home enough, for choosing duty over family once too often. The funeral was full of uniforms. Old soldiers who'd served with him, young soldiers who'd heard his stories, officers who'd respected his service. They folded the flag with military precision and handed it to my mother with words about honor and sacrifice. Emily wouldn't touch it. "This is what killed him," she said, staring at the triangle of fabric. "This whole system, this whole way of thinking." I took the flag home with me, kept it in my footlocker along with his medals and the commendation letters from his commanding officers. Evidence of a life that had meant something, even if it had ended badly. But Emily's reaction stayed with me. The way she looked at the flag like it was contaminated. The way she looked at me in my dress uniform like I was carrying the same disease that had killed our father. I should have seen it coming, the way she'd eventually look at my own service, my own choices, my own willingness to carry weight that normal people couldn't handle. I should have seen that when the time came, she'd choose safety over truth. Choose the story that made sense over the story that was real. But I was too busy being excellent, too busy proving that the James family tradition of service meant something, too busy believing that doing the right thing would be enough. I was wrong. The call came on a Thursday in March. Joint training exercise at the Naval War College in Newport. They needed a combat ethics advisor for something called Operation Blackwater, a black flag training scenario designed to test decision-making under extreme pressure. Black flag meant no rules, no Geneva Conventions, no clear distinction between right and wrong. The kind of exercise that pushed future officers to their breaking point, then asked them to find their way back to their moral center. I'd done ethics advisory work before, usually involved sitting in on briefings, observing training scenarios, writing reports about how well the participants balanced mission objectives with ethical considerations. Clean work, academic work. This felt different from the start. The briefing room at Newport was packed with personnel I didn't recognize. Not just Navy, Army, Air Force, Marines, plus civilians with the kind of blank expressions that screamed intelligence community. The kind of mix you only saw when something was bigger than it appeared. The scenario is straightforward, said Colonel Peterson, the exercise commander. Terrorist cell has taken control of a military academy. Hostages include faculty and cadets. Your job is to advise on rules of engagement, while our trainees attempt rescue operations. He handed me a folder marked with classification stamps I hadn't seen since my SOCOM days. Everything's compartmentalized. You'll observe from the command post, maintain radio silence unless directly asked for input, and document decision-making processes for post-exercise analysis. Radio silence. In ethics advisory work, that usually meant staying invisible unless someone made a choice that crossed legal lines. But something about Peterson's emphasis made it sound more like a warning than a guideline. The exercise began at 0600 on a Friday. The academy was actually a decommissioned training facility about 20 miles inland. Old brick buildings, narrow hallways, perfect for close-quarters combat scenarios. I watched from the command post as the first wave of trainees moved in. These weren't fresh officers, they were seasoned personnel, the kind who'd seen real combat, who understood that training mistakes could become real-world disasters. That should have been my first warning. The second warning came when the terrorists started using real ammunition. I was monitoring radio chatter when I heard the distinct crack of live rounds, not the modified blanks we used for training. The trainee voices on the radio shifted from confident to confused to genuinely frightened. Command, this is Alpha Team. We're taking real fire. Repeat, we're taking real fire. Peterson's voice came back calm, controlled. Continue mission. Adapt to scenario parameters. I looked at the tactical display. Alpha Team was pinned down in a hallway, Beta Team was attempting to breach from the north, and somewhere in the building, the hostages, actual cadets from the War College, were waiting for rescue. That's when I realized this wasn't a training exercise anymore. Someone had turned the scenario real. Whether through intelligence breach, inside manipulation, or simple catastrophic failure, the people in that building were in actual danger. I reached for my radio to call it in, but Peterson's hand clamped down on my wrist. Maintain radio silence, Captain. That's an order. I looked at his face and saw something I'd learned to recognize in my intelligence work. The expression of someone who knew more than they were saying, who was willing to let bad things happen to protect larger interests. Sir, there are people in that building. There are people in that building completing a necessary exercise. Your job is to observe and document, not to interfere. The radio crackled with more voices. Beta Team had made contact with the hostages, but they were trapped in a classroom on the second floor. The terrorists had them surrounded, and the ammunition they were using was definitely not simulation rounds. I watched the tactical display and made a choice that would end my career. I grabbed my radio and broke protocol. All units, this is Command Ethics Advisor. I'm declaring this exercise terminated. Repeat, exercise terminated. All personnel exit the building immediately through predetermined routes. Peterson tried to grab the radio, but I was already moving toward the door. Captain James, you are ordered to remain in position. Sir, with respect, people are about to die for a training exercise. That's not a choice I can document and file away. I left the command post and drove toward the academy. My authorization code still worked on the perimeter security, and I made it to the building before Peterson could stop me. The scene inside was chaos. Real chaos. not the controlled confusion of a training scenario. I found Beta Team in the stairwell. 3 members wounded their team leader trying to coordinate evacuation while maintaining position. "Ma'am, you need to get out of here," he said when he saw me. "This whole thing's gone sideways." I helped him carry one of the wounded soldiers to the exit point, then went back for the hostages. The cadets were terrified, 18 and 19 years old, trapped in a situation they'd never trained for, watching their instructors bleed real blood. We got them out, all of them. The wounded soldiers, the frightened cadets, even the terrorists who turned out to be contractors using live ammunition because someone had given them the wrong briefing, told them this was a real-world interdiction, not a training exercise. 23 people went home that night because I broke radio silence. But the investigation focused on the breach of protocol, not the breach of security that had caused the problem in the first place. The JAG hearing, basically the Army's version of a courtroom, was held behind closed doors. Everything was classified. No public record, no press coverage, no accountability for whoever had turned training into a death trap. They couldn't court-martial me without revealing the details of Operation Blackwater, so they chose a different path. Disciplinary discharge under classified review. Military record sealed. Service terminated with prejudice. They handed me a box with my personal effects and a commendation medal, the Bronze Star I'd earned for saving those lives. But someone had cracked it, removed the engraving that would have carried my name. "Administrative error," the clerk said, not meeting my eyes. "We can have it replaced." I looked at the broken medal, at the fractured bronze that caught the light like a wound, and realized they were giving me a choice. Accept the crack, accept the erasure, and disappear quietly, or fight it and risk having the whole story come out in ways that might endanger the people I'd saved. I took the cracked medal and signed the NDA, non-disclosure agreement. They silenced me with paperwork, but they couldn't silence what I'd done. Some truths don't need headlines. They just need someone who knows where to look. The discharge paperwork was final on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, I was calling home. Emily's phone went straight to voicemail. My mother's landline rang and rang. I tried Emily's husband, Marcus, the number I'd called dozens of times over the years, when I needed to reach family while deployed. Disconnected. I drove to Rhode Island that weekend, still wearing civilian clothes that felt like a costume. The NDA meant I couldn't explain what had happened, couldn't tell them why I was suddenly home for good, why my career had ended so abruptly. But I could be there. I could be present, available, ready to rebuild whatever bridges my absence had damaged. The house looked the same. Mom's garden still bloomed with the military precision Dad had taught her, rows of flowers standing at attention, not a weed out of place. Emily's car was in the driveway, next to Marcus's truck. I rang the doorbell. Emily opened the door, but she didn't step back to let me in. She stood in the doorway like a sentry, her body blocking my view of the interior. "Claire, what are you doing here?" "I wanted to see you, to see Mom. I've been trying to call. This isn't a good time." Behind her, I could hear voices, Mom's laugh. Marcus talking, the sound of normal family life happening in the space I'd once belonged to. "When would be a good time?" I asked. Emily's expression shifted, became something I'd never seen before. Not anger exactly, not fear, something colder. "I don't know. Things are complicated right now." She closed the door. I stood on the porch for 10 minutes, waiting for her to change her mind to open the door and explain what complicated meant. But the house stayed quiet, and eventually I walked back to my car. That was the last time I saw Emily face to face for 15 years. The erasure began slowly. Family group texts that used to include me simply stopped. Social media posts that had once tagged me in family gatherings no longer appeared on my feed. Birthday calls that had been tradition for 20 years went silent. I told myself it was temporary, that they needed time to process whatever story they'd constructed about my discharge, that eventually someone would reach out, ask for my side of things. But months passed, then years, and the silence became permanent. I discovered the extent of it by accident. A mutual friend from high school tagged me in a throwback photo from Emily's wedding, a group shot, where I'd been standing next to the bride, wearing my dress uniform, holding a champagne flute. In the version she posted, I was gone, cropped out so cleanly that you couldn't tell someone had been removed. Emily's smile remained the same, but the space where I'd stood had been filled with background as if I'd never existed. I went through Emily's social media systematically, looking for other photos I knew I'd been in. Family Christmas mornings, Dad's funeral, Emily's baby shower, graduation parties, birthday celebrations spanning 2 decades. Gone. All of it. Not just cropped out, digitally erased. The kind of precise editing that takes time, intention, and access to original files. That's when I started investigating. The digital trail led me to our family cloud storage account, the shared space where we'd uploaded photos for years, where Mom kept digitized versions of old family albums, where Emily stored videos of every family gathering. Someone with administrative access had been busy. Every photo containing me had been modified. Every video edited. Every digital trace of my existence in the James family carefully scrubbed away. The metadata told the story. The edits had been made over a period of months, always from the same IP address, always using Marcus's login credentials. Marcus, Emily's husband, the man who'd been my partner for 3 years before he decided Emily was a safer choice. I should have seen it coming. The way he'd looked at me during those last months together, like I was a problem that needed solving. The way he'd started asking questions about my work, about why I couldn't just do something normal, like Emily wanted. The way he'd left me for my sister 2 weeks after I'd been deployed to Fort Bragg for advanced training. She's more stable, he'd said when I confronted him. She doesn't carry all that weight you carry. He was right. Emily had never watched our father pace the hallway at night. Never learned to sleep with one ear open for trouble. Never developed the hypervigilance that came with knowing the world was full of people who wanted to hurt you. She was the safe choice. The choice that came with regular schedules and predictable emotions and no classified secrets that couldn't be shared. I'd been angry then, but I'd understood. Military relationships were hard. My work was hard. I'd made peace with losing him to someone who could offer him the life he wanted. But I'd never imagined he'd try to erase me entirely. The deeper I dug, the more systematic the erasure became. Not just photos and videos, but documents. Family tree websites where I'd been removed from the James lineage. Obituaries where my name had been deleted from the list of survivors. Even Mom's medical records where I'd been listed as emergency contact for years. Someone had been thorough. I called Mom one last time using a number I'd found in her church directory. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Mom, it's Claire." Silence. Then, "I don't think this is a good idea." "Mom, I just want to talk. I want to understand what happened." "What happened is that you made choices, and now we have to live with the consequences." "What consequences? I saved people's lives. I did the right thing." "You did what you thought was right, but it cost us everything. The shame, the questions, the way people look at us now." I realized then that they'd created their own version of my story. Without knowing the classified details, without understanding what had really happened, they'd filled in the blanks with their worst fears about what I might have done. "Better one ghost than a public disgrace," Mom said quietly. The line went dead. I sat in my apartment staring at the cracked metal on my kitchen table and understood that the erasure was complete. They'd chosen their version of reality, one where I'd never existed, where their family was whole and unburdened by whatever shame they imagined I'd brought them. Marcus had given them the tools to forget me. Emily had given them the permission. And Mom had given them the blessing. I was officially a ghost. I found out I was pregnant 3 weeks after the discharge. The morning sickness had started during the JAG hearings, but I'd attributed it to stress, to the crushing weight of watching my career dissolve in a closed courtroom where I couldn't defend myself. The doctor at the civilian clinic confirmed what the home test had already told me. 8 weeks along, due in February, Marcus's child. Conceived during our last weekend together before he'd chosen Emily, before my world had imploded. I called him from the parking lot, sitting in my car with the ultrasound photo on my dashboard. "You need to know something," I said, when he answered. "Claire, we've talked about this. Emily and I are trying to move forward. I'm pregnant." The silence stretched long enough that I thought he'd hung up. Finally, "Are you sure it's mine?" The question hit like a slap. After 3 years together, after everything we'd shared, he was questioning my integrity. "Yes, I'm sure." "What do you want from me?" "I want you to know you're going to be a father." "I can't. Emily and I were planning our own family. This complicates everything." I understood then that he wasn't just choosing Emily over me. He was choosing the life they could build together over the complication I represented. "I'm not asking you to leave her," I said. "I'm just telling you the truth. Don't call me again unless it's an emergency. He hung up. I carried Katie alone, worked temp jobs that didn't require security clearances, lived in a studio apartment in Providence, saved money for baby supplies I bought secondhand. The NDA meant I couldn't explain to potential employers why a decorated military officer was suddenly applying for administrative work. The isolation was complete. No family support, no military community, no network of friends who understood what I was going through. Just me and the growing life inside me figuring out how to build something from nothing. The accident happened in my 7th month. Black ice on Route 95, my car sliding into a guardrail at 40 miles per hour. I woke up in Rhode Island Hospital with a concussion, 3 broken ribs, and doctors telling me they needed to monitor the baby. I was there for 5 days, alone. That's when Emily made her move. The social worker who came to my room on day 3 was professional, sympathetic, and carrying paperwork I didn't understand until it was too late. Your sister has expressed concern about your ability to care for the child, she said. Given your recent discharge from military service and current mental health status, she's filed for temporary custody, pending a court evaluation. My mental health status. She showed me documents I'd never seen before. Psychological evaluations claiming I was suffering from PTSD, depression, and severe adjustment disorder. Letters from therapists I'd never met describing treatment sessions that had never happened. These are falsified, I said. I've never seen any of these doctors. Ms. James, I understand this is difficult, but your sister and her husband are offering a stable home environment for the child. They have steady employment, a house, and no history of military-related trauma. The trap was perfect. Emily had used my own discharge against me, created a paper trail that painted me as mentally unstable, dangerous to myself and others. The NDA meant I couldn't explain what had really happened, couldn't defend myself without violating federal law. You have the right to contest this in court, the social worker said. But given the current documentation and your circumstances, I'd recommend considering what's best for the child. I tried. God knows I tried. But every lawyer I consulted came to the same conclusion: fighting Emily meant risking exposure of classified information, which meant federal charges that would make custody irrelevant because I'd be in prison. Katie was born on February 12th, 7 pounds 2 ounces. Perfect. I held her for 18 hours before the social worker returned with the court order. Temporary custody to Emily and Marcus, pending psychological evaluation and determination of my fitness as a parent. I never got the chance to be evaluated. The system moved slowly, then stopped entirely when I couldn't afford the legal fees to keep pushing forward. Emily named her Katie, raised her as her own daughter, told her I was a distant relative who'd had problems and couldn't be part of their lives. But I never left. I created the Matthew Fund 3 months after Katie's birth, named it after the trainee I'd saved at Newport, the 19-year-old who'd walked away from that building because I'd broken protocol. The fund was small at first. Money from temp jobs, from selling my car, from pawning everything I owned that had value. But it grew. Anonymous donations to Katie's school for music lessons. Scholarship payments for summer camps. Book money that appeared in Emily's account with no explanation. I watched from a distance as Katie learned piano, as she went to space camp, as she read every book I'd loved as a child. I couldn't be her mother, but I could make sure she had opportunities. College prep courses, SAT tutoring, application fees for schools I'd researched carefully, knowing which ones had the best programs for whatever Katie might want to study. Emily never questioned the money. Maybe she thought it came from Marcus's work, from family accounts she didn't monitor. Maybe she didn't want to look too closely at unexpected blessings. I attended Katie's school concerts from the back row, watched her science fairs from the parking lot, saw her graduate high school from behind the gymnasium, close enough to hear her name called, but too far away for her to see me applaud. 17 years of loving someone from the shadows. 17 years of being a mother without being allowed to be a parent. When Katie enlisted, I knew my watching days were ending. She was choosing her own path, building her own future. Soon she'd be too far away for me to follow, too independent for my silent support to matter. That's when I decided to risk everything for one moment of being seen. One moment of standing in the same space as my daughter, not as a stranger in the shadows, but as someone who belonged there. Someone who had earned the right to witness her success. I discovered my own legend by accident. It was 2018, 3 years after Katie's high school graduation. I was working as a security consultant for a private firm in Boston background checks threat assessments, the kind of work that used my military training without requiring clearances I no longer had. A client mentioned he was developing ethics training for his company's overseas contractors. Former military, he'd heard about a case study they used at the War College, something called The Last Stand at the Academy. Fascinating stuff, he said, pulling up a presentation on his laptop. This officer had to choose between following orders and saving lives. Chose to save lives, even though it ended their career. They teach it as the gold standard for moral courage under pressure. I watched him scroll through slides that detailed the Newport incident. My incident. The timeline was accurate, the tactical decisions precisely documented the outcome, clearly stated 23 people saved, because one officer broke protocol. But the name on the case study read Captain C. James. No first name, no gender markers. In some versions, the officer was referred to as he. They'd turned me into a ghost story, a cautionary tale about the cost of doing the right thing, sanitized and anonymized until I became a theoretical construct, rather than a real person who'd lost everything for that choice. Where did they get this information, I asked. Military archives, I assume, though the details are probably classified. They only teach the broad strokes ethical framework decision-making process, consequences of action versus inaction. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral, while my mind raced. The details in that presentation were too specific, too accurate to have come from official reports. Someone had leaked the real story, but carefully selectively preserving the lesson while protecting the classified elements. That night, I went through my storage unit and found the USB drive. I'd kept it for 17 years, hidden in a box with my father's flag and my cracked metal. It contained everything from Newport audio recordings, from my radio tactical maps I'd downloaded during the exercise real-time communications between units, even the original briefing materials that had outlined the training scenario. Evidence of what had really happened, proof that Operation Blackwater had been compromised from the start, that someone had deliberately turned training into a death trap, that I'd saved lives while others had tried to cover up their mistakes. I'd never used it, never leaked it to journalists or uploaded it to whistleblower sites. Not because I was afraid of violating the NDA, but because exposing the truth would have meant exposing the people I'd saved. The trainees who'd gone on to have careers, families, lives that might be complicated by becoming public symbols of institutional failure. But seeing my story taught as a nameless legend made me realize something: they'd found a way to honor what I'd done while erasing who I was. The lesson lived on, but the teacher had been deleted. In faculty lounges and training centers across the military, officers debated the ethics of Captain C. James's choice. They analyzed the decision matrix discussed. The competing loyalties praised the moral courage required to break protocol for a higher purpose. They just didn't know they were talking about a woman who'd lost her family, her career, and her child for that moment of moral clarity. I started researching how widespread the case study had become. Military academies used it in ethics courses. War colleges included it in leadership seminars. Private military contractors referenced it in training materials. The story had taken on a life of its own, evolving with each retelling. In some versions, Captain C. James had died in the rescue. In others, they'd been promoted for their heroism. The truth that the officer had been quietly destroyed by the same institution that now taught their story was too complicated for the narrative they wanted to tell. But the core remained consistent when faced with an impossible choice. One person had chosen humanity over hierarchy. Lives over orders, truth over institutional convenience. I touched the scar on my arm, the one visible record of that day that no one could edit or delete. A piece of shrapnel from the building had caught me during the evacuation, leaving a permanent mark that ran from my wrist to my elbow. Emily had asked about it once, years before the erasure began. I'd told her it was from a training accident, which was technically true. She'd suggested I get plastic surgery to reduce the visibility. Scars tell stories, I'd said. Maybe someone needs to remember this one. Now I understood what I'd meant. The scar was proof I'd been there, proof I'd acted, proof that Captain C. James wasn't just a theoretical construct, but a real person who'd bled for the choice they'd made. The USB drive held the evidence. The scar held the truth. And somewhere in lecture halls across the country, My daughter's generation was learning that sometimes doing the right thing cost everything. They just didn't know the cost had a name. Or that the person who'd paid it was still watching, still hoping that the lesson would matter more than the teacher, still believing that some truths were worth preserving even if the people who lived them had to disappear. The notification came through a Google alert I'd set up years earlier. Katie James, plus military, plus enlistment. Local news story from Emily's hometown. 3 paragraphs about promising young recruits heading to basic training. Katie's photo smiling in her civilian clothes, standing next to Emily and Marcus at the recruitment office. Catherine James, 18, daughter of Emily and Marcus James, has enlisted in the Army and will begin basic training at Fort Jackson in South Carolina. Catherine plans to pursue military intelligence after completing her initial training. Military intelligence, my field, the specialty I trained for, excelled and lost everything for. I read the article 7 times, studying Katie's face for signs of the woman she'd become. She had my jawline, my direct gaze, but Emily's softer features around the eyes. She looked confident, determined, ready for whatever came next. She looked like someone who'd never doubted she belonged exactly where she was. I closed the laptop and walked to my storage unit, unlocked the metal door, and stared at the box I'd kept sealed for 17 years. Inside the USB drive with the Newport recordings, the cracked metal from my discharge, my father's flag, and a small jewelry box containing the special operations pin from my uniform. The pin was smaller than a quarter black metal with gold accents. To most people, it looked like military decoration. To those who knew it, identified me as someone who'd operated in spaces that didn't officially exist, who'd been trusted with secrets that could reshape nations. I'd earned it. They'd never taken it back. I sat on the concrete floor of the storage unit, holding the pin and thinking about choices. For 17 years, I'd chosen invisibility. Chosen to love Katie from a distance, to support her without claiming credit, to let Emily and Marcus build their version of family, without interference from the ghost they'd created. It had been the safe choice. The choice that kept everyone's life stable, that didn't disrupt the narrative they'd constructed, that allowed Katie to grow up without the complexity of knowing her real mother was a woman, her family considered dangerous. But Katie had chosen military service. She'd chosen my path, the path that had cost me everything. In a few months, she'd be learning the same lessons I'd learned, facing the same impossible decisions that had defined my career. She'd be studying ethics cases that included my story, learning from my choices without knowing they were mine. The irony was perfect and terrible. My daughter would be taught to make moral decisions under pressure, using a case study about her own mother's sacrifice. She'd analyze Captain C. James's choice to break protocol and save lives, never knowing she was analyzing the moment that had cost her mother everything. I could stay erased, let Katie complete her training, build her career, live her life, without the complication of knowing the truth about her origins. It was the safe choice, the choice that protected everyone from difficult conversations and painful revelations. Or I could risk everything for one moment of being seen, not to explain myself, not to reclaim her, not to destroy the life Emily and Marcus had built for her, just to be present for the moment when she officially became a soldier, to witness her success from the same space, breathing the same air, existing in the same reality, to stop being a ghost for one day. I picked up the special operations pin and fastened it to my jacket lapel. The metal felt heavier than I remembered, weighted with significance I'd forgotten it carried. It identified me as someone who'd served at the highest levels, who'd been trusted with the most sensitive operations. Someone who'd chosen duty over comfort, truth over convenience, lives over orders. The USB drive went into my inside jacket pocket along with the cracked metal, not because I planned to use them, but because they were part of the story. Evidence of who I'd been, what I'd done, what it had cost. I drove to South Carolina with no plan except to be there, to stand in the same space as my daughter when she graduated from basic training, to exist visibly in her world for the first time since she was 18 hours old. I didn't expect recognition, didn't expect conversation, didn't expect anything except the satisfaction of being present for the moment when Katie officially joined the institution that had defined my life, the institution that had erased me but couldn't erase what I'd done. For one day, I would stop hiding. For one moment, I would risk everything to be seen. Not as the ghost Emily had created, but as the woman who'd earned the right to witness her daughter's success, as Captain Claire James, the woman behind the legend they'd been teaching all along. The ceremony had ended 20 minutes ago. Families clustered around their new soldiers, taking photos, exchanging contact information with other parents, making plans for celebration dinners. The formal structure had dissolved into the warm chaos of reunion. I remained in my position at the edge of the field, watching Katie navigate the congratulations. She moved with military bearing, now shoulders back, handshakes firm, eye contact direct. Basic training had refined something that was already there, turned natural confidence into disciplined presence. Emily and Marcus flanked her like protective bookends, steering conversations, managing introductions. They looked proud, accomplished, like they'd personally engineered every moment that led to this success, which in their version of reality, they had. I was preparing to leave when Sergeant Davis finished his conversation with another family and turned in my direction. The movement was casual at first, just a scan of the remaining crowd, but then his gaze caught on me and held. I watched recognition work across his face in stages. First the scar, the raised line of tissue that ran from my wrist to my elbow, visible now that I'd pushed back my sleeves in the heat. His eyes moved to the pin on my lapel, taking in the special operations insignia that most people wouldn't recognize, but that screamed significance to anyone with military experience. Then his gaze returned to my face, and I saw the moment when pieces clicked into place. He took a step toward me, then stopped. Looked at me again, checking his assessment. I could see him running calculations, age bearing the way I stood like I was still on duty, even in civilian clothes. He approached slowly, respectfully, the way you'd approach a monument you weren't sure you were allowed to touch. "Ma'am," he said when he was close enough for quiet conversation. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but..." He paused, visibly gathering courage. "Are you Captain James?" The question hung between us like a live wire. I could have denied it, could have smiled politely and said he had me confused with someone else. But something in his voice, respect mixed with genuine curiosity, made me choose truth. "Yes." He straightened slightly, not quite attention, but close. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant First Class Davis. I've been teaching combat ethics for 3 years now." He paused, glancing around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "They made us study you. The Last Stand. We don't even know how it got out, the details, but it changed how we teach command decisions." I felt the familiar weight of that story, the way it had taken on its own life, separate from the person who'd lived it. "What do you teach about it?" "That sometimes doing the right thing costs everything. That moral courage isn't about following orders, it's about knowing when orders are wrong." His voice carried the conviction of someone who'd thought deeply about these concepts. The officer in that case study saved 23 lives by breaking protocol. Lost their career for it, but saved 23 lives. And what's the lesson? That some choices are worth making even when you know the cost. That leadership isn't about protecting yourself, it's about protecting the people who depend on you. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. Hearing my choices described as leadership, as moral courage, after 17 years of believing I'd simply failed it, shifted something fundamental in my chest. "The thing is," Sergeant Davis continued, "we teach the case study, but we never knew what happened to the officer afterward. Captain C. James just disappeared from the records. Some of us wondered if they'd died in the incident, if that's why the story was so heavily classified." "Not dead," I said quietly. "Just erased." He was about to respond when I heard footsteps approaching. We both turned to see Katie walking toward us, curiosity clear on her face. Emily and Marcus trailed behind, their expressions shifting from puzzled to alarmed as they recognized me. "Sergeant Davis," Katie said, "is everything all right?" He looked between us, understanding dawning in his expression. The family resemblance was subtle but unmistakable. Once you were looking for it, the same direct gaze, the same way of holding ourselves like we were ready for whatever came next. "Private James," he said carefully, "I was just speaking with this lady about military ethics. She has some experience in the field." Katie studied my face, and I saw the moment when recognition began to flicker. Not full understanding, not yet, but awareness that this conversation mattered in ways she didn't quite grasp. "That's," she said slowly, her voice carrying the weight of a question she wasn't sure she was allowed to ask. "That's my mother." The words weren't directed at me. They were directed at the universe, at the gap between what she'd been told and what she was seeing. A statement disguised as a question seeking confirmation of something that didn't fit the story she'd been raised with. Sergeant Davis looked at me, seeking permission to respond. I gave him a small nod. "Ma'am," he said to Katie, his voice gentle but certain. "This is Captain Claire James, the officer from the case study I mentioned in your ethics class last month, the one who chose to save lives over following orders." Emily had gone pale behind Katie, and Marcus looked like he was calculating exit strategies. But Katie's expression was different, focused, analytical, like she was processing new intelligence and adjusting her understanding of the world accordingly. She took a step closer to me, studying my face with the directness I recognized from looking in mirrors. "You're really her?" she asked. "You're really my mother?" This time, the question was directed at me. And for the first time in 17 years, I had the chance to answer it honestly. "Yes," I said, "I really am." The parking lot offered privacy that the graduation field couldn't provide. Katie had excused herself from Emily and Marcus with the kind of military directness that didn't invite argument. "I need to speak with her privately. I'll meet you at the car in 20 minutes. She walked toward me with measured steps, each footfall deliberate. The way she moved reminded me of myself at that age, purposeful, direct, unafraid of difficult conversations. We stopped about 6 feet apart, close enough for quiet conversation, but far enough to maintain the careful distance that 17 years of separation had created. "Why didn't you come back for me?" she asked. The question was simple, direct, and impossible to answer without revealing the full complexity of what had happened. I looked at her face, so familiar yet shaped by experiences I'd never shared, and chose honesty over explanation. "I wanted to. I just wasn't allowed to. Without risking the little peace you had." She tilted her head slightly, processing this. "Allowed to by who? The law, the system, the people who decided that your life was better without complications." Complications? I gestured toward the pin on my lapel, toward the scar on my arm. My career ended badly. There were legal issues, classification problems, family dynamics that got messy. Fighting for custody would have meant exposing you to all of that. Katie was quiet for a long moment, studying my face like she was comparing it to some internal reference. "The Matthew Fund," she said finally. The name hit me like a physical blow. I kept my expression neutral, but she was watching carefully enough to catch the flicker of recognition. "You know about that music lessons I never asked for, summer camp scholarships that appeared out of nowhere, college prep courses that Emily said were gifts from the extended family." Katie's voice carried the precision of someone who'd been assembling pieces for a while. "But we don't have extended family with money. And the payments always came with the same reference number." I said nothing, but she didn't need confirmation. "Matthew Turner," she continued. "That was the name on the scholarship letters. I looked him up when I turned 18. Found out he was a trainee who died in a training accident at the Naval War College in 2007. Except he didn't die, he graduated, got commissioned, served 3 tours overseas. She'd done her research. Thorough, methodical, exactly the kind of investigation I would have conducted at her age. So I started wondering why someone would name a scholarship fund after a living person," she said. "And why that fund seemed to be specifically designed to support one kid in Rhode Island." "What did you find?" "References to a classified training incident at Newport. An officer who broke protocol to save lives, including a trainee named Matthew Turner. The officer was identified as C. James in the case studies, but the details were heavily redacted." She paused, letting the implications settle between us. The timeline matched. The location matched. And when I started comparing photos of Emily from when I was little to photos of you, she shrugged. "The resemblance is pretty obvious once you're looking for it." I felt something loosen in my chest, relief maybe, or recognition. She hadn't stumbled into this truth accidentally. She'd pursued it with the same methodical intelligence that had defined my own career. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked. "To who?" "Emily and Marcus. They had their story, and it seemed to work for everyone involved. I figured there had to be a reason you stayed away." She studied my face. "I thought maybe you didn't want to be found. I wanted to be found every day for 17 years. The admission escaped before I could stop it, carrying more emotion than I'd intended." Katie's expression softened slightly, but she didn't step closer. "Then why the secrecy? Why the anonymous payments and the distance?" "Because approaching you meant approaching them, and approaching them meant explaining things I wasn't legally allowed to explain." I touched the pin on my lapel. There are rules about classified operations, about non-disclosure agreements, about what happens when military personnel are discharged under certain circumstances. What circumstances? I looked at her standing there in her dress uniform, fresh from basic training, about to begin her own military career. She deserved truth, but not all truths were mine to share. The kind that end careers, but save lives. The kind that make you a case study instead of a person. Understanding flickered in her eyes. The Newport incident. You're Captain C. James. I'm Captain C. James. She was quiet for several minutes, processing this confirmation. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, not just curiosity anymore, but respect. 23 people. That's how many lives you saved. That's how many people went home to their families that night. And it cost you everything. I looked toward the graduation field, where other families were still celebrating, still taking photos, still building memories that would last lifetimes. Not everything, I said. It cost me the right to watch you grow up. But it didn't cost me the ability to make sure you had the opportunities you deserved. Katie followed my gaze, then looked back at me. The Matthew Fund wasn't just about guilt, was it? It was about making sure I had choices. It was about making sure you could become whoever you wanted to become, without limitations imposed by other people's mistakes, even if it meant you never got credit for it. Especially if it meant I never got credit for it. I didn't go back to Emily and Marcus, didn't walk across the parking lot to explain myself or demand acknowledgement or create the dramatic confrontation they probably expected. Quiet revenge isn't about making scenes. It's about leaving truth where it can be found by the people who need it most. Katie and I talked for another 10 minutes, exchanging basic information: where I lived, what work I did, how to reach me if she wanted to. Nothing heavy, nothing that demanded immediate decisions or complicated family dynamics. Just the practical details of two people who might want to stay in contact. I ship out to my first duty station next week, she said. Fort Gordon, Georgia, signal intelligence training. Good program. You'll learn things there that will serve you for life. Will you? She paused, choosing words carefully. Will you be reachable if I have questions about the work, about military life? I'll be reachable. She nodded, satisfied with this small promise. Then she walked back to Emily and Marcus, who were waiting by their car with expressions that mixed relief and wariness in equal measure. I watched them drive away, three people who'd built a life together on a foundation of carefully maintained silence. They weren't evil people. They'd just chosen the version of reality that felt safest, that required the least explanation, that protected them from uncomfortable truths. I understood the choice. I might have made the same one in their position, but understanding didn't mean accepting. And it didn't mean leaving things unfinished. That evening, I drove to Fort Jackson's visitor parking area. The base had quieted down after the day's ceremonies, but new soldiers were still moving in and out of the barracks, settling into their temporary housing before shipping out to their first assignments. Katie's unit was housed in Building 472. I'd memorized the number during the graduation ceremony, watched her point it out to Emily and Marcus when they'd asked about her living arrangements. The barracks security was tight, but not impenetrable. 23 years of military experience had taught me how to move through institutional spaces without attracting attention. I waited until the evening formation ended, until most of the soldiers had dispersed to evening activities or phone calls home. Katie's duffel bag sat on her bunk, partially packed for her transfer to Fort Gordon, standard military issue identical to dozens of others in the building, but identifiable by the small name tape sewn above the main compartment. I slipped the USB drive and the cracked metal into the side pocket, along with a note written on hotel stationery. I was never gone, just redacted. See? Simple, direct, true. The USB contained everything: audio recordings from Newport Tactical Communications, real-time decision-making under pressure. Not because I wanted to expose classified operations or settle old scores, but because Katie deserved to know the real story behind the case study she'd been taught. She deserved to hear her mother's voice making the choices that had saved 23 lives and cost everything else. I left the base the way I'd entered, quietly, without confrontation, without demanding recognition for what I'd done. The truth would speak for itself when Katie was ready to hear it. 3 days later, I got a text from an unknown number. Listen to the files. Now I understand. Thank you for Newport. Thank you for the music lessons. Thank you for never giving up. Okay. I saved the message but didn't reply immediately. Some conversations need time to develop, need space to grow without pressure or expectation. Katie had the truth now. What she did with it was her choice to make. Months passed. Occasional text updates about her training, questions about military life that only someone with my experience could answer. We built a relationship slowly, carefully, without disrupting the life she'd already established with Emily and Marcus. They never contacted me, never acknowledged what had happened at the graduation ceremony. They maintained their version of reality, and I respected their right to do so. But the truth had been restored to its rightful place. Katie knew who she was, where she'd come from, what sacrifices had been made for her opportunities. She understood the difference between the story people told about her family and the reality of what had actually happened. They erased my name, but not what I did. Some truths don't need headlines. They just need someone who knows where to look. And sometimes quiet revenge is just making sure the right person knows where to look. Would you want to know the truth about your parents, even if it broke everything you thought was real? Comment below if you've ever been rewritten in someone else's story. Because sometimes the most powerful victories happen in silence. Sometimes justice is just making sure someone knows what really happened. And sometimes love is letting the truth speak for itself.